I call Dr. Pamji Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to take this call to speak on the social assistance, portability to Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau bill in its third reading. Mr. Speaker, this is a great bill for the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau because this bill seeks to provide greater pension flexibility for people, those who wish to retire in these three Pacific nations, the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau. And Mr. Speaker, this bill, as acknowledged by the member who just spoke, is about recognizing our special constitutional ties with these three Pacific nations which enjoy shared New Zealand citizenship and unique legal arrangements. And Mr. Speaker, under our current portability arrangement, eligible people are required to be resident and present here in New Zealand at the time of applying for their superannuation at the age of 65. So this bill is to remove that resident and present requirement. So, Mr. Speaker, there is a residence condition, which is that to be eligible for New Zealand superannuation or veterans pension, people should have lived here for 10 years after the age of 20, which includes 5 after the age of 50, which means people can actually, those who wish to, can retire in these three island countries at the age of 55. So they can go to these island countries to retire at the age of 55. And when they turn 65, they can apply for their New Zealand superannuation from any of these three Pacific nations. And Mr. Speaker, the Social Services Select Committee received 13 submissions, and they were thoroughly considered. 6 were orally heard, and I can say that most of those submissions were in support of this bill. And I want to acknowledge our chair, Alfred Naro, and also want to acknowledge our Minister, Honorable Ann Tolley, for the work that she has done on this bill. And I also want to acknowledge all submitters, Mr. Speaker, for the time they took to come to make those submissions. And we had thorough discussions on points which were raised. And one issue that was, which came up and was widely discussed was depopulation. And this was actually linked to 5 years rule after 50. And Mr. Speaker, I also note SOP by New Zealand First to make a change to exempt these three Pacific nations, the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau, from this 5 years after 50 rule. And Mr. Speaker, I was here in the House when the House was in the committee stage debating this bill. And my observation was that, well, I didn't expect Labour to be fair, but New Zealand First, they were pleading to get support for their SOP, but they could not provide even single reason why their SOP should be supported. The only reason came from their side was that it's not that many people. It's not about how many people. It's about fairness. It's about having a balanced approach. And Mr. Speaker, this was coming from that party that thinks they have some common sense. They think they have some common sense, but there was no common sense in their SOP or to get support. To get support, yes, no common sense, Mr. Speaker, and that's true. So there was no common sense, there was no fairness, and there was no reason given why that should be amended, Mr. Speaker. So that was very interesting for me to sit here and watch, Mr. Speaker. But this national government is committed to all. This national government is working for all. We are an efficient and fair government, Mr. Speaker. We are not unfair like them. And with this bill going through doesn't mean that this will apply only to people, those who originally come from the Cook Islands, Niue or Tokelau, because, Mr. Speaker, once this bill goes through, this provision will be available to all those eligible people, those who wish to retire in these three Pacific nations. And this also doesn't mean that it is the kind of flexibility that we want to provide to people. Doesn't mean that all people, those who are from the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau, will take up this provision. So it's about providing a greater flexibility. And we know that there are around 650 people in the Pacific, those who are receiving New Zealand superannuation, and out of these 650, around 300 are in the Cook Islands. And we also know that with this legislation going through, there will be around 245 those who will benefit with an increase of 16 per year. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand government is always committed to our relationship with Pacific nations. We have strong cultural, political, and economic ties with Pacific nations. And with these three Pacific nations, the Cook Islands, Niue, and Tokelau, we have very special relationship, Mr. Speaker. We call it free association. And as a result of this free association, people from these three Pacific nations, they enjoy New Zealand superannuation, and also there is substantial assistance from government to their governments. And so there is this very close linkage, and employment opportunities here in New Zealand are better. So it is natural that people from these Pacific nations are attracted to New Zealand. And with these three Pacific nations, there is even greater attraction because they have New Zealand citizenship and right to residence. So that issue of depopulation is a real one. So that is why, Mr. Speaker, this bill is really important. This bill is to help these three Pacific nations with that issue. And so this bill will make people go to these Pacific nations if they wish to at the age of 55 and apply for their New Zealand superannuation at the age of 65 from any of these three Pacific nations. And Mr. Speaker, this national government recognizes that New Zealanders have worked hard and they deserve to enjoy their retirement. And we want them to have as many options as possible. And Mr. Speaker, it's very hard to say what will be the cost of this to the Crown, but we know that this move will definitely help these three Pacific nations, the Cook Islands, Niue, and Tokelau. And this bill is to help these three Pacific nations socially, economically, and will also reduce the impact of depopulation they have in these three Pacific nations. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is about keeping it fair, because this bill is, once it goes through, it will be applicable to all eligible people, those who wish to retire in these three Pacific nations. And this 5-year after 50 rule applies to all, even New Zealand-born people, those who have gone overseas and come back and want to spend their retirement here, or others, those who want to go to other countries and spend their retirement there. So, Mr. Speaker, it is about fairness, it is about having a balanced approach, and this, as I said, this national government is about fairness. We analyze everything with fairness point of view, and that is why, Mr. Speaker, that 5 years 50 rule SOP we are not supporting. But this bill is a great bill to support these three Pacific nations. This bill is about recognizing our special relationship with these three Pacific nations, and I'm really delighted to commend this bill and support this bill, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Yeah.